The logjam was broken, of course, when the president demanded a compromise, accepting several of Forrestal's reservations and recommendations. Only a weak national security establishment, a shadow of Truman's original proposal, was created in 1947, and the Secretary of Defense was severely limited in his authority over the still separately administered Army, Navy, and Air Force. The catch was that Truman appointed Forrestal, the vehement opponent of full unification, as the first Secretary of Defense, and in essence told him to live with the office he had created. It didn't take Forrestal long to decide that a stronger Secretary of Defense, with the support of a staff Department of Defense, was a necessary reform. "I was wrong," he told White House counsel Clark Clifford. "I cannot make this work. No one can." Still, Forrestal gave the job his all for 2 years, but its rigors drove him to a nervous breakdown. McCullough writes, "Afflicted with insomnia and loss of appetite, Forrestal appeared strangely drawn and aged, his shirt collars too large for him. Some days he would telephone the president several times on the same subject, which mystified Truman. Privately, Forrestal told close friends that his phone was being tapped. At meetings, he would unconsciously scratch a particular part of his scalp until it turned raw." Forrestal finally resigned his position on March 29, 1949, and 2 months later copied these lines from Sophocles. "Worn by the waste of time, comfortless, nameless, hopeless save in the dark prospect of a yawning grave." And then he jumped 16 stories to his death. Secretary Forrestal's breakdown and suicide shocked the nation and added urgency to the 1949 amendment of the National Security Act, which Congress passed and Truman signed in August of that year, 5 months too late for Forrestal. The amendments replaced enemy with DOD, the Department of Defense, and created a stronger Secretary of Defense, as well as deputy and assistant secretaries to aid Forrestal's successors in carrying out their responsibilities. In 2008, the branches of the military are still learning to get along under DOD. By the time Harry Truman departed the White House in 1953, our modern national security apparatus had been born. Strong institutions existed to provide the leadership needed in foreign and military policy. The National Security Council was working to coordinate the two with domestic policy, and the CIA was gathering and interpreting human source intelligence and influencing events abroad through covert ops. Historian Michael Hogan has pointed to the law of unintended consequences, noting that after the act, the military intelligence apparatus became the biggest and fastest growing piece of the government. Foreign policy decisions became more sweeping and less democratically accountable. Adventurism abroad became more sweeping and less democratically accountable. In other words, after the National Security Act, the stage was set for an American military buildup and for aggressive engagement in the Cold War. Now we're here to talk about President Bush today, aren't we? I'll get there, I promise. President George W. Bush, our nation's 43rd president, has several notable points in common with our 33rd president, Harry Truman. The two share personal attributes in common. Bush made a run for the presidency in 2000, emphasizing his common man appeal by speaking plainly to the people and not giving a darn about what the intellectuals thought. That's you guys. He, and certainly not Al Gore, was the candidate you would want to have a beer with. Truman, a farmer and our only modern president who never earned a college degree, had a similar common man appeal. During his 8 years in office, President Bush was often accused of being loyal to a fault, loyal to Donald Rumsfeld, loyal to Harriet Myers, to Alberto Gonzales, among others. Truman's loyalty led him home to Kansas during his vice presidency to mourn the death of Tom Pendergast, a corrupt political boss and convicted tax evader, for whom Truman endured considerable grief. He also stuck by Secretary of State Dean Acheson after political opponents accused him of appeasement and blamed him for losing China to communism. Bush and Truman shared similar qualities in foreign affairs. The Bush Doctrine declared that we would fight terrorists abroad preemptively and unilaterally if necessary, so that we wouldn't have to fight them at home. The Truman Doctrine became the basis for U.S. containment policy during Cold War, preventing the spread of Soviet-style communism. Both men had difficulty sizing up Russians, Truman describing Stalin as benign and fatherly, Bush famously looking Putin in the eye to get a sense of his soul and discovering a man who is straightforward and trustworthy. Their presidencies shared a similar fate. Both fought unpopular wars, saw their approval ratings plummet to some of the lowest ratings in history, and both, rebuked by voters, turned the White House over to the opposition party. Of course, not the least among these similarities, Bush followed Truman as one of the nation's greatest reformers in national security. When President George W. Bush was sworn into office in January 2001, a revision of Truman's national security apparatus did not appear to be in the cards. The Cold War had ended a decade ago. No immediate security threats appeared on the horizon, and Bush had campaigned on a moderate anti-interventionist foreign policy platform. However, the events of September 11, 2001 obviously changed matters. 9 months after the attacks, Governor Tom Ridge told Congress in prepared testimony that President Bush recognized that the threat we face from terrorism requires a reorganization of government similar in scale and urgency to Truman's unification of the Department of Defense and the creation of the CIA and NSC. No significant changes were in store for the Department of State or the Defense Department. Instead, considerable blame for 9/11 was placed on failed domestic security and intelligence. Recall, these are the vital elements of national security: foreign policy, military policy, domestic security policy, coordinated and informed by the best possible intelligence. Between 2002 and 2004, President Bush focused his energy on domestic security policy, largely ignored by Truman, and on intelligence. In President Bush's equation, the Homeland Security Act of 2002 was his equivalent of the National Security Act of 1947. Indeed, it represented the single largest reorganization of the executive department, or the executive branch, since Truman's legislation. It merged 22 different government agencies with diverse histories and cultures, and 170,000 employees into a new cabinet-level Department of Homeland Security, charged with securing the borders, preventing terrorist attacks, reducing American vulnerabilities, and responding to disasters. The department subsumed and reorganized offices from departments as diverse as agriculture, energy, defense, justice, transportation, the Treasury, and the FBI. It overtook U.S. Customs and the Coast Guard, the Secret Service and FEMA, transportation security, and immigration and naturalization. At the same time, the Homeland Security Council was established within the White House to act as the homeland equivalent of Truman's National Security Council.